I don't even know why I'm writing this. Maybe it's guilt, maybe it's to get it off my chest, or maybe I just need someone to hear this because I feel like I'm losing my mind. Either way, I've got to start somewhere. So here's the thing. I hate my job, like soul-crushing hate. I work in a small office for this cheap-ass company that barely pays me enough to survive. My bosses? Let's just say they're the type of people who would sell their own mothers for a few extra bucks in profits. They yell at us over stupid things, treat us like garbage, and then go home to their perfect little lives while we're left picking up the pieces. I've worked there for 5 years. 5 freaking years. And in that time, I've gotten exactly one raise, 2%. Not even enough to cover inflation. I'm drowning in debt, my car's falling apart, and I can barely afford rent. Meanwhile, my bosses drive Teslas and spend their weekends on yachts. It's not just unfair, it's infuriating. And then there's him, my main boss, let's call him Steve. Steve's the worst of them all. He's one of those guys who thinks he's God's gift to humanity because he built the company from nothing. But really, he inherited it from his dad. He struts around the office like he's untouchable, barking orders, making people cry, and openly mocking anyone who dares to question him. Last week, he humiliated a co-worker in front of everyone because she asked for time off to take care of her sick kid. He actually said, maybe if you worked harder, you could afford a nanny. Who says that? Who even thinks like that? That was the breaking point for me. I don't have kids, but something about the way he said it, so smug, so heartless, made my blood boil. I've never felt rage like that before. It wasn't just anger, it was like this primal need to hurt him, to make him pay for all the misery he's caused. And the scary part? That feeling didn't go away, it just sat there, festering, growing darker and darker, until one day I found myself Googling something I never thought I'd Google. How to hire a hitman. I know how insane that sounds. Believe me, I do. But at the time, it felt like a solution. I wasn't thinking straight. I was drunk, like blackout drunk, and angry, and I just wanted him gone, forever. I ended up on some sketchy forum, the kind of place that's buried deep in the dark web. It was full of threads about all kinds of illegal stuff, drugs, weapons, you name it. And there it was, a post titled Professional Problem Solver, Discreet and Reliable. I clicked on it, half expecting it to be some kind of joke. But it wasn't. The guy who made the post called himself Mr. Clean, which sounds stupid now, but at the time, it felt professional? I don't know. The post had all these details about how he worked, his code of ethics, whatever that means for a hitman, and even testimonials from satisfied clients. It felt legit. Too legit. I should have stopped there. I should have closed my laptop, gone to bed, and chalked it up to a drunken mistake. But I didn't. I messaged him. The first thing he asked was for details. Who, why, how soon. I didn't use real names, obviously. I told him I wanted Steve gone because he was abusive and ruining my life, which wasn't even a lie. He responded within minutes, asking for an advance payment in Bitcoin. It wasn't cheap, $5,000 up front, another $10,000 after the job was done. I told him I'd think about it and logged off. The next morning, I woke up with the worst hangover of my life and a sick feeling in my stomach. I told myself it was just a drunken impulse, that I wasn't actually going to go through with it. But then I went to work, and the second I walked through the door, Steve was already on my case. He said I was late, I wasn't, accused me of slacking off, I wasn't, and threatened to dock my pay if I didn't get my act together. By lunchtime, I was back on that forum, sending Mr. Clean the Bitcoin. It felt surreal, like I was watching someone else do it. Even as I typed the message, I kept telling myself, this isn't real, this isn't actually happening. But it was. And once I hit send, there was no going back. A few days later, I got a reply. It was a single sentence. It's in motion. be patient. That's when the paranoia started. Every time the office phone rang, I jumped. Every time someone knocked on my door, my heart skipped a beat. I started avoiding Steve, which wasn't hard because he barely noticed me unless he needed someone to yell at. But still, I couldn't shake this feeling that I was being watched, like someone was always right behind me, just out of sight. Then yesterday, something happened that I can't explain. I was working late, everyone else had gone home, and the office was dead silent. I was sitting at my desk, going through some files, when I heard footsteps. Not the normal kind, though. These were heavy, deliberate, like someone was sneaking. I froze, my heart pounding, and listened as they got closer and closer. "Hello?" I called out, trying to sound calm. No response, just the sound of those footsteps echoing down the hallway. I grabbed a stapler, because, that'll stop a murderer, and crept toward the sound. The hallway was dark, most of the lights were on motion sensors, and they hadn't kicked on yet. As I turned the corner, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Steve's office door was wide open, and inside there was a shadow, a tall, dark figure just standing there, motionless. I blinked, and it was gone. I don't know what's happening. I don't know if Mr. Clean is messing with me, or if my guilt is playing tricks on my mind, or if this is some kind of sick joke. But one thing's for sure. I started something I can't undo, and now I'm terrified of what's coming next. After that night, things started to feel off. I don't mean the usual stress or paranoia. I mean like something was wrong. It wasn't just in the office anymore. It followed me home. I live in a pretty crappy apartment. Thin walls, creaky floors, the whole deal. Normally, the noise from my neighbors drowns out everything, but that night, it was dead silent. Too silent. I remember sitting on my couch, trying to distract myself with some dumb sitcom, but I couldn't focus. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting someone to knock or bust it down. Then, around midnight, I heard it, a scraping sound, like metal on metal. At first, I thought it was the pipes, or maybe someone dragging something outside. But the sound didn't stop. It was slow, deliberate, like someone was trying to make me notice it. I grabbed a kitchen knife and tiptoed to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peek outside. There was no one there. Just the empty parking lot, lit by a single, flickering streetlight. But the sound kept going. I followed it to my front door. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode. When I looked through the peephole, I didn't see anything at first. Just the hallway, empty and dimly lit. But then I noticed something, a small piece of paper taped to the door. I yanked the door open, knife in hand, but the hallway was empty. Whoever had been there was gone. The note was short, written in shaky handwriting. "You're next." My stomach dropped. I don't know if it was a threat, a warning, or what, but it was enough to make me slam the door and triple lock it. I stayed up all night, clutching that stupid knife, jumping at every little sound. By the time the sun came up, I convinced myself it was just some random prank, maybe a neighbor messing with me or some drunk idiot who got the wrong apartment. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. This wasn't random. The next day at work, Steve was in a weird mood. He didn't yell at anyone, which was a first. Instead, he stayed in his office with the door closed, talking on the phone in hushed tones. The rest of the office noticed too. People were whispering about it, wondering if something had happened. At lunch, one of my co-workers joked that maybe Steve finally got some bad news for once. I laughed, but it felt forced. If only they knew. By the end of the day, Steve called an all-hands meeting. He stood at the front of the room, looking more rattled than I'd ever seen him. He started talking about security concerns and how the company was going to start implementing new measures. Surveillance cameras, keycard access, the works. He didn't go into specifics, but it was clear he was scared. That should have made me feel good, right? Like, maybe Mr. Clean was doing his job and Steve was finally getting a taste of his own medicine. But instead, I felt sick. This wasn't how I imagined it. I wanted him gone, not this. Whatever this was. That night, the nightmares started. I don't usually remember my dreams, but this one was different. I was in the office, alone, except it wasn't really the office. It was darker, twisted, like something out of a horror movie. The walls were stained with something dark and sticky, and the air reeked of rotten meat. I was walking down the hallway towards Steve's office when I heard it, the sound of a man screaming. Not just any scream, though. It was full of pain, terror, like he was being torn apart. I ran toward the sound, my feet sinking into the sticky carpet with every step. When I reached the door, it creaked open on its own. Inside, Steve was sitting at his desk, but his face was gone. It was just a bloody mess, chunks of flesh hanging where his nose and eyes should have been. And he was still screaming. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing like I'd just run a marathon. I didn't sleep after that. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, or what was left of it. The next morning, I found another note. This time, it was inside my apartment. I don't even know how they got in. There were no signs of forced entry, and all the locks were still in place. The note was on my kitchen counter, written in the same shaky handwriting as before. He's watching you. I dropped the note like it was on fire. I checked every corner of my apartment, every closet under the bed, behind the shower curtain. Nothing. But the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. It was like there were eyes on me no matter where I went. At work, things got even worse. Steve wasn't just scared anymore, he was paranoid. He started snapping at people for no reason, accusing them of stealing or slacking off. Or at one point he even accused one of my co-workers of trying to undermine him. The poor guy looked like he was about to cry. By the end of the day, half the office had either quit or called in sick. The place was falling apart and I couldn't help but feel like it was my fault. That night, I got another message from Mr. Clean. This one wasn't through the forum though, it was a text. I don't know how he got my number, but there it was, staring at me from my phone. I need more time. Things are complicated. Complicated? What the hell was that supposed to mean? I wanted to reply, to ask what the hell was going on, but before I could, another text came through. Don't try to back out, it's too late for that now. That was the moment I realized I wasn't in control anymore. I thought I was hiring someone to do a job, but I'd unleashed something I didn't understand and now I couldn't stop it, even if I wanted to. If the paranoia was bad before, it became unbearable after that last text. I couldn't focus, couldn't eat, couldn't think straight. Every sound, every shadow felt like a warning. I wasn't just scared anymore, I was trapped. No way out, no undo button, just this spiraling mess I'd thrown myself into. The day after the text, something happened that still makes me feel sick just thinking about it. Steve didn't come into work. At first, nobody thought much of it. Maybe he was sick, or maybe he'd finally cracked from all the stress. But as the day dragged on, rumors started flying. Someone said they saw police cars outside his house. Another person swore he'd been arrested for something. Nobody had any real answers. By lunchtime, the office was buzzing with gossip. People were whispering in small groups, speculating about what could have happened. I kept my head down, pretending to work, but my mind was racing. I checked my phone every 5 minutes, half expecting another text from Mr. Clean, but nothing came. Then around 3 p.m, the HR lady, let's call her Nancy, came into the office. Nancy was one of those overly cheerful types, always smiling, always trying to boost morale. But that day, She looked like she'd seen a ghost. She called everyone into the conference room, her voice shaky, like she was barely holding it together. When we were all seated, she cleared her throat and said, "I have some difficult news to share. Steve was found dead in his home this morning." Dead. That word hit me like a freight train. I felt my stomach drop, my palms sweating. Dead? Number. That couldn't be right. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. Nancy kept talking, but I barely heard her. Something about a home invasion, how the police were investigating, but didn't have any suspects yet. She said there were signs of a struggle, that it looked like Steve had fought back. But the details... God, the details. "The scene was gruesome," she said, her voice trembling. "I won't go into specifics, but it was clear this was deliberate. Whoever did this wanted to send a message." My co-workers gasped, some of them whispering to each other in shock. I just sat there, staring at the table, trying not to puke. A message. What kind of message, and to who? When the meeting ended, I went straight to the bathroom and locked myself in a stall. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock my phone. I opened the forum, but the post from Mr. Clean was gone, like completely wiped. No messages, no trace of our conversation. It was like it had never existed. I don't know how long I sat there, just staring at my screen, but eventually my phone buzzed. It was another text. Phase 1 complete. Phase 1? What the hell was that supposed to mean? I wanted to throw my phone across the room. This wasn't what I wanted. I wanted Steve gone, sure, but not like this. Not murdered in his own home. And what the hell was Phase 2? That night, I didn't go home. I couldn't. The thought of being alone in that apartment made my skin crawl. Instead, I drove around aimlessly, trying to figure out what to do. I thought about going to the police, but what could I say? "Hi, I hired a hitman to kill my boss, but now I'm scared it's gone too far." Yeah, that'd go over real well. Around midnight, I parked in some random lot and just sat there, staring at the steering wheel. That's when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A car, parked a few spaces down, with its lights off. At first, I didn't think much of it, but then I realized it had been there for a while. Too long. My heart started racing as I glanced at my rearview mirror, trying to see if anyone was inside. I couldn't tell. I turned the key in the ignition, my hands slick with sweat, and pulled out of the lot. The car didn't move at first, but then, as I turned onto the main road, I saw it in my rearview mirror. It was following me. I tried to stay calm, convincing myself it was just a coincidence, but every turn I took, every random street I turned onto, the car stayed right behind me. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. Finally, I floored it, speeding through back roads and praying I wouldn't crash. When I finally lost it, I pulled into a gas station and sat there, trying to catch my breath. That's when I got the next text. "You're being watched." I dropped my phone like it was a live grenade, my vision blurred, my ears ringing. How did he know? How the hell did he know? I drove home after that, even though every fiber of my being was screaming not to. When I walked into my apartment, it felt different, like someone had been there. The air was heavy, the kind of heavy that presses down on your chest and makes it hard to breathe. I checked every room, every closet, but everything looked untouched. Everything except for one thing. On my kitchen counter, there was a small box. I didn't recognize it, and there was no return address, just my name scrawled in black marker. My hands were shaking as I opened it, and what I found inside nearly made me pass out. It was a thumb drive, and taped to it was another note. "Watch this." I didn't want to. I knew whatever was on that drive would ruin me, but I couldn't not watch it. I plugged it into my laptop, and my screen filled with a grainy video. At first, it was hard to make out, but then the image sharpened, and I realized what I was looking at. It was Steve, tied to a chair, blood dripping down his face. He was begging, crying, pleading for his life. I couldn't hear what he was saying. The audio was distorted, but his face said it all. And then, out of nowhere, a figure stepped into frame. He was wearing a mask, something crude and handmade, with slits for the eyes and mouth. He didn't say anything. He just raised a knife and I slammed the laptop shut, bile rising in my throat. I ran to the bathroom and threw up, shaking so hard I could barely stand. The image of Steve's face, his terrified eyes, was burned into my mind. This wasn't just a hit, this was a spectacle, a performance. And now I was next in the audience. The thumb drive changed everything. Until that moment, I could almost convince myself that this whole thing was just some twisted misunderstanding. But seeing Steve like that, seeing what they did to him, it made everything real. Too real. And now I couldn't get it out of my head. I didn't go to work the next day. I couldn't. The thought of walking into that building, knowing what happened to Steve, was too much. Instead, I stayed in my apartment, pacing back and forth, trying to figure out what to do. The walls felt like they were closing in, the silence was deafening, and every little sound outside made me jump. I hadn't eaten in over 24 hours, but my stomach was in knots. Food was the last thing on my mind. By mid-afternoon, my phone buzzed again. Another text. Phase 2 begins tonight. Be ready. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. Be ready? Ready for what? I wanted to reply, to tell him to stop, to call the whole thing off, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. This wasn't about me anymore. It had taken on a life of its own. That evening, as the sun started to set, I heard a knock at my door. My heart nearly stopped. I grabbed the knife from the kitchen, my pathetic attempt at self-defense, and crept toward the door. Another knock, louder this time. "Who is it?" I called out, my voice shaking. No answer, just silence. I looked through the peephole, but no one was there. My hand was on the doorknob, ready to lock the deadbolt, when something slid under the door. A piece of paper folded neatly. I waited a few minutes, listening for any sign of movement, before finally picking it up. The note was short, but it made my blood run cold. "Look outside." Against my better judgment, I walked to the window and peeked through the blinds. At first, I didn't see anything, just the empty parking lot, dimly lit by the flickering streetlight. But then I noticed it, a black van parked across the lot. Its headlights were off, but the engine was running. I could see the faint glow of someone smoking inside. My phone buzzed again. Another text. "You're being watched. Don't do anything stupid." Panic set in. I locked every door, every window, and pulled the blinds shut. My mind was racing. Who were they? What did they want? I couldn't call the police. What would I even say? That I hired a hitman and now I'm being stalked? No way. Hours passed and the van didn't move. I sat on the floor of my living room, knife in hand, staring at the door. My phone was next to me, but I couldn't bring myself to look at it. Every time it buzzed, I jumped, but I didn't read the messages. I couldn't. I just sat there, waiting until exhaustion finally got the better of me. I don't know how long I slept, but when I woke up, it was dark. The van was gone. At first, I thought maybe it was over that they'd left, but then I noticed something that made my skin crawl. My laptop, which I'd left closed on the kitchen counter, was open. The screen was on, displaying a live feed of my apartment. It took me a second to realize what I was looking at. The camera feed was coming from inside the apartment. I could see myself, sitting on the floor in the living room, holding the knife. The angle was from above, like it was taken from a hidden camera in the ceiling. My phone buzzed again. This time, I read the message. Nice knife. Too bad it won't help you. I dropped the phone, my chest tightening as I scanned the room, looking for the camera. How long had they been watching me? Were they still here? My apartment wasn't big. It took less than 5 minutes to check every room, every closet, every possible hiding spot. But there was nothing. That's when I realized it wasn't just a camera. It was them. They'd been inside while I was asleep. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry, my voice barely a whisper. I grabbed my keys and bolted out the door, not even bothering to lock it behind me. My car was parked at the far end of the lot, and every step felt like an eternity. My head was on a swivel, my ears straining for any sound, any movement. When I finally reached the car, I practically threw myself inside and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life and I peeled out of the lot, not caring if I woke the entire neighborhood. I drove aimlessly for hours, too scared to go home, too paranoid to stop anywhere. My phone buzzed again, but I ignored it. I couldn't take any more. By the time the sun came up, I was running on fumes, both in my car and in my body. I pulled into a diner parking lot, the kind of place that's open 24/7, and just sat there, staring at the steering wheel. I finally mustered the courage to check my phone. There were 5 unread messages. The first 4 were from Mr. Clean, but the 5th was from an unknown number. I opened it and my stomach dropped. It was a photo of me, sitting in my car in the diner parking lot. The message underneath read, "You can't run." That's when I realized this wasn't just about Steve anymore. They weren't just sending a message to him, they were sending one to me. I didn't think things could get worse. I really didn't. But that picture, me, sitting in my car outside the diner, made it clear. I wasn't just a client to these people anymore. I was a loose end. And loose ends don't get to walk away. I stayed in the diner for hours, my mind racing. I couldn't eat, couldn't think straight. Every time someone walked in, I flinched, half expecting it to be them. I kept checking my phone, dreading the next text, but nothing came. For a brief moment, I convinced myself that maybe, just maybe, they'd given up. That they'd gotten what they wanted and were done with me. Then the power went out. It happened so suddenly that everyone in the diner froze. The hum of the lights, the buzz of the soda machine, even the soft chatter of the other customers. It all stopped. Just silence. The kind of silence that presses down on you, makes it hard to breathe. And in that silence I heard it. The faint hum of an engine outside. I don't know why I looked. Maybe some part of me needed to confirm what I already knew. I stood up and walked to the window, my legs feeling like jelly. And there it was. The black van, parked right outside, its headlights off, but the engine running. I couldn't see who was inside, but I could feel their eyes on me. I turned to the waitress, my voice trembling. "Does your phone work?" She shook her head, frowning. "Nah, it's all out. Power's down too." That's when I realized they'd done this. They'd cut the power, taken out the phones, left me stranded. I grabbed my keys and bolted for the door, ignoring the shouts from the staff. The van's engine revved as I stepped outside, but I didn't stop. I ran to my car, fumbling with the key, and got inside just as the van's headlights flicked on. They followed me. Of course they followed me. I drove like a madman, weaving through side streets, running red lights, doing everything I could to lose them. But no matter what I did, they stayed right behind me, their headlights a constant reminder that I wasn't getting away. Finally, I spotted a gas station up ahead, a big one, with bright lights and a few cars parked out front. I figured if I could get into a crowd, maybe they'd back off. I pulled in, screeching to a halt, and jumped out of the car, running inside. The clerk gave me a weird look, but I didn't care. "They're after me," I gasped, barely able to get the words out. "Call the cops." He frowned. "Who's after you?" Before I could answer, the door swung open, and two men walked in. They weren't wearing masks or anything, but there was something about them, the way they moved, the way they looked at me, that made my stomach churn. They didn't say a word, they just stood there, blocking the exit. I backed up, my hands shaking. The clerk must have noticed because he stepped forward, trying to defuse the situation. "Hey, is there a problem?" One of the men reached into his jacket and pulled out a knife. "Not for you," he said, his voice cold and emotionless. "Leave." The clerk froze, his eyes wide. I didn't wait to see what he'd do. I grabbed a bottle off the nearest shelf and threw it at the guy with the knife. It shattered against his shoulder, giving me just enough time to bolt toward the back of the store. I could hear them coming after me, their footsteps pounding against the tile floor. I ran into the stockroom and locked the door behind me. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might explode. There was no way out, just shelves of inventory and a single, barred window. I pressed myself against the wall, clutching a rusty crowbar I'd found, and waited. The pounding started a few seconds later. The door shook as they slammed against it over and over, each hit louder than the last. "You can't hide forever," one of them shouted. "You think this ends with Steve? You're part of this now." Part of this. Those words stuck with me, even as the door started to splinter. What did they mean? Was this about more than Steve? Had I gotten myself tangled up in something bigger than I realized? The door finally gave way, and the two men stepped inside. I swung the crowbar as hard as I could, catching one of them in the arm. He grunted, dropping his knife, but the other guy tackled me before I could swing again. We hit the floor hard, and the crowbar slipped from my hands. He pinned me down, his face inches from mine, and whispered something I'll never forget. "You'll wish you died with him." Then everything went black. I woke up in a dark room, tied to a chair. My head was pounding, my mouth dry, and the metallic taste of blood lingered on my tongue. The room was empty except for a single camera mounted on a tripod, its red light blinking. A voice crackled through a speaker in the corner. "You thought this was about money, didn't you? About power? Number? This is about control." The voice was calm, almost bored, but every word sent shivers down my spine. "Steve wasn't the first. He won't be the last. You started this, and now you're part of it. Congratulations." The camera zoomed in, its lens focusing on my face. I tried to speak, to plead, but the gag in my mouth muffled my words. "You wanted him gone," the voice continued. "Now you're taking his place." The camera's red light blinked faster, and I realized what was happening. They weren't just going to kill me, they were going to make it a show, just like Steve. The last thing I heard before the room went dark was the click of the camera and the voice's final words, "Smile for the audience." I don't know how this will end. Maybe you'll read about me in the news, another unexplained disappearance. Or maybe this post will be the only proof I ever existed. Either way, if you're thinking about doing what I did, don't. Whatever your problem is, it's not worth it. Because once you let them in, they never let you go.